I can still smell the damp forest from that morning, even months later. I was driving up the Ridge Road toward the station near Ridge Creek, a road the locals call barely a road for a reason. Loose gravel, sharp drop-offs, and trees so close to the edge that one careless swerve would throw you off the incline. I had my camera gear packed in the back and a rented SUV that barely could make the climb. My assignment was simple: photograph and interview a ranger about to retire after 40 years. The directions were minimal. GPS didn't work this far in. They just told me I'd see the station when I got there, and to use my radio if I needed anything. I arrived in the late afternoon. The station itself was functional, not charming. It had a metal roof and log walls that had been replaced and patched over decades. There was a thin path that wound to the front door. And there he was, the ranger. He looked a little older than I expected, but he wasn't frail. His eyes were sharp in a way that made me feel a little tense for a second, like he was trying to read me instead of look at me. "I'm Roger," I said. "I'm here for the interview and photos." He nodded slowly. "Well, let's get it over with then." It wasn't hostile, but his tone carried a kind of detachment. But I set up my camera while he moved to pour coffee from a thermos. We began talking, and for a while it was routine. We talked about patrolling trails, rescues, encounters with various wildlife. I asked him about his most memorable experiences, expecting the usual anecdotes about lost hikers. Instead, but the way he described animal movements, the patterns of deer and coyotes. It wasn't like he had just observed it. It was like he really knew it in some deep way. He mentioned a shadow that follows you on certain trails, and laughingly said that most folks wouldn't notice it. But once you see it, you can never unsee it. "A shadow?" I asked. "Just an old superstition," he said quickly. The night comes fast in the mountains. I had set up my camera to capture the ridge in the last light. The forest was quiet. I tried the radio again. It was technically receiving, but none of the messages would download. The staff knew of the weak signal here and told me I might need to hike a little higher to actually pull in the messages. I figured fine, I would just wait until morning. Breakfast was quiet. We awkwardly talked about our plans for the day before I packed up and started hiking to the signal point. The trail was barely there and slick with last night's rain. At the clearing where the radio would finally pull the messages, I found myself fumbling with the device. While I waited, I inserted the card from my camera into my laptop to download the shots. But there was nothing there. I double-checked everything. Every one of my SD cards was empty. I felt a tight knot of panic, but I tried to stay calm. A chime let me know that the messages had finally started downloading. A message from my boss arrived. "Power outage at the station. Ranger left yesterday and made it back to main base. Feel free to head back." I glanced around the clearing. The trees were still, but I felt like I could hear someone moving behind me. My pulse spiked. I turned, and there he was. Not the ranger who had left, but someone who had taken his place. I tried to say hello, but I choked, and he just watched me. I wanted to run, but I figured I'd be safest if I continued to pretend that I didn't know anything was off. So I tried to act normal. I mentioned that I thought I had enough and would probably head back, but he told me I couldn't leave yet. He placed one hand on my arm, and I could feel the warmth of his grip, the weight of his body pressing slightly forward. I felt trapped. Every tree around me, every slope in the earth seemed designed to prevent me from escaping. I don't know what gave me the idea, but I started fake coughing, twisting violently, and he stepped back with confusion. I slammed my elbow against his chest, and he grunted, startled, and I bolted. I barely noticed the thorns and roots tearing at my clothes, and I never looked back, not even once. I finally reached my SUV. With burning lungs and shaking hands, I drove down the ridge as fast as I dared, without thinking about what I may have just escaped. We never found out who was at the station. By the time more staff made it out to the remote station, there was no sign of anyone at all. I love nature because it is real. The trails that run through the park, the trees, the wildlife, all real. But sometimes, something else is there too. And no matter how far you drive, how carefully you follow directions, or how well you think you know the wilderness, some things don't want to be observed. Because they are the observers. I have gone back to the Cascades, but I avoid Ridge Creek. I'll take the long roads, any other trail. And I never let my camera out of my sight, even though I'm certain that some things are better left unseen. In December 2023, I took a 3-week vacation to Japan. My family owns a hotel near a small mountain town in western Japan, a large traditional inn built into the side of a hill near a river. The area surrounding the hotel has been inhabited for at least 2 millennia and is considered sacred. My father once told me when the hotel was under construction that builders uncovered several old stone blocks and pillars. Apparently, a small shrine had stood there sometime around the 9th century. I hadn't stayed at the hotel in over 15 years, so I was excited to relive the experience, and remembering my father's story, to do some off-trail exploring. I hoped I would find traces of those ancient ruins. I picked up a rental car near the train station and drove toward the hotel. It was snowing heavily and traffic was awful, so a 1-hour trip turned into 2. I reached the hotel around 8 p.m., and it was completely empty. No staff, no guests. December is the off-season, and tourists rarely visit the area in winter. The emptiness gave the whole place a surreal, abandoned feeling. I grabbed a key from behind the unattended counter and let myself into a suite, where I went to sleep. The next morning, I headed into the forest below the hotel. Snow reached my ankles, and trudging through uneven terrain in winter boots was grueling. I walked far enough to lose my sense of direction, and when I checked my phone, there was no signal at all. I had been hiking for about an hour when I realized that I was lost. Trees surrounded me on all sides, and a large hill rose directly ahead. I figured climbing it might give me a vantage point to spot the hotel or any other signs of civilization. The ascent was steep and rocky, but off to my left I noticed what looked like the remnants of an old path, just wide enough to once have been walked. I worked my way over and followed it upward. The path was overgrown with dead branches but still navigable. Eventually, it led me close to the summit, where it abruptly ended. I noticed a small cavity in the hillside, half hidden by vegetation, maybe 5 meters above the path. I climbed up to it and found myself standing at the entrance of a narrow cave. Mud had washed partially across the opening, but it was still large enough for me to fit through. I had a small flashlight, and when I shone it inside, I saw a shallow alcove with another opening to the left. That's when the smell hit me, strange and pungent, kind of like the animal enclosures at a zoo. The alcove was empty except for a large rectangular stone block placed squarely in the center. I moved deeper inside and reached a much larger chamber. 2 tunnels branched off from it, though I didn't explore them. And on the far side of this chamber sat another rectangular block. This one was hollow. I approached it and froze. Inside were human bones. Around them lay a long piece of steel and a scatter of old bronze coins, the kind with a square hole in the middle. I don't know why, but I reached down and picked one up. It was old and corroded, but markings were still faintly visible. Then a loud crash echoed from deep within one of the tunnels. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, and reached for the long piece of steel resting among the bones. It felt like the remnants of an old blade. I began backing toward the entrance, and then I smelled something new beneath the stench. Smoke. Rhythmic thumping echoed from deep inside the tunnel, like someone striking a drum. And that was the moment I snapped and ran. I sprinted toward the opening as the cave vibrated around me, with enough force to shower loose dust from the ceiling. I dove out of the entrance, tumbled down the snowy slope, and crashed hard into the ground below. The steel blade slipped from my hands, but I didn't check back for it. I just kept running. Snow blasted into my face, but I didn't stop until I heard the sounds of a car somewhere nearby. I stumbled from the side of a road, gasping, shaking, and dizzy with relief. I was able to flag down a passing driver, who hesitated, clearly startled, but eventually stopped and let me in. That was when I learned that I was over 4 miles away from the hotel. When I got back, I went to my room and grabbed my belongings and drove straight back into the city. I had no intention of spending another night alone in that building. When the hotel reopened in February, my father texted me. Someone had broken in through a first-floor window. Nothing was stolen or damaged, except for the door to the suite that I had stayed in that night. It had been smashed open with something heavy and metallic. I'll never know if it's connected to what I found in that cave, but I will never stay in the hotel again. It was the summer of 2024, and my 3 buddies and I were desperate for a break from our internship at the Kennedy Space Center. We'd been buried in rocket data for weeks, but as star geeks, we craved a night under a pristine sky. We pored over light pollution maps and Google Maps, zeroing in on a remote clearing deep in Tate's Hell State Forest, a swampy, desolate stretch of Florida's panhandle. The name came from an old legend about a settler who'd vanished in the swamp in the 1800s, supposedly cursed. We brushed it off. Ghost stories were for kids. We just wanted to see the stars. We rented an Airbnb about 30 miles from the forest's edge. After work that Friday, we loaded our cars with blankets, snacks, and a telescope. The 7-hour drive from the space center was grueling, and we got to the Airbnb late, dropping our bags and quickly grabbing a snack before heading back out again. That final stretch into Tate's hell was brutal. Narrow dirt trails twisted through dense pines and murky wetlands, the air thick with cicadas and the occasional splash of something in the water. With no cell service, we used walkie-talkies to stay connected between cars, their crackles cutting through the darkness. Finally, around 2 a.m., we reached the clearing, tired and buzzing. But the sky was unreal. The stars were blazing like they were close enough to grab. We spread out blankets, set up the telescope, and sat back to enjoy. 15 minutes later, my buddy Sam's voice hissed over the radio from the other car. "You guys see that? Headlights." We turned, and a faint glow crept along the trail that we'd driven in on. We were 40 miles from the nearest town at 2 in the morning in a massive forest. There was no reason anyone should be just passing by. Jake, who was sitting next to me, told me to flash the lights at them and see what they did, so I flicked them on and off 3 times. It was an old pickup, rusted and battered, and it rolled to a stop about 100 yards away. We saw a few shadowy figures stepping out, 2 or maybe 3. It was so hard to tell in the glare. And they just stood there. We could hear their faint voices, but couldn't understand anything they were saying. "Why would they stop right there?" Marcus's voice asked over the radio from the other car. "This is messed up." I turned on my flashlight and aimed it at them, but it didn't reach. Jake tried to stay cool. "It's probably just locals, but maybe we should move." We agreed over the radios to find another spot, with one rule in mind, that if those lights showed up again, we were heading straight back to the Airbnb. We headed back to the main trail and drove for around a mile until we reached another clearing. But 5 minutes later, the same headlights sliced through the dark, and they parked much closer now. Jake and I were in one car, and Marcus and Sam in the other. We floored it out of there, and those headlights stuck to us. We were 4 young, basically defenseless interns, alone in a cursed swamp at 2 a.m., in a place literally called Tate's Hell. You don't meet good people out there. I pushed the car to its limits, with Marcus right behind us. The trail veered, and for a second as we turned, the truck's headlights vanished, and I prayed we'd lost them. But moments later, they were back. We hit a fork. I swerved left, hoping it would lead to the main road. And finally, after what felt like forever, the dirt turned into pavement. A faded highway sign glowed ahead. I looked back for the headlights, but they were gone. The drive back to the Airbnb was silent. We stumbled inside, locked the door, and tossed around the possibilities. Were they poachers? Drug runners? Someone with something to protect deep in those woods? Or maybe it was something tied to the old tales of Tate's Hell. The way they watched us. The way they chased us without rushing. It didn't feel like a prank. We never went back there. When I drive on those lonely Florida roads at night, there's a part of me that is permanently more aware and alert. But there's another part of me that never left Tate's Hell.